I'm going to be talking to you about skills and training and the future of market research. So I really wanted to share some details today about some of the research that NewMR has been doing and is about to start doing that looks at skills development and training in market research and insights. So why are we focusing on skills? Well, I think it's fair to say that at NewMR we've always really been focusing on skills, but we wanted to perhaps be a little bit more formal, put a little bit more research behind our discussions of research and training. We've always been really passionate about encouraging learning and also providing people with, accessible options for learning more about research. Now, whether that's accessible in terms of, time, cost, time shifting via Play Again, we've always wanted to help people learn. And we have this really strong belief that it's becoming more and more important to focus on your skills, keep continuing to learn, and it's just becoming more and more important every day. Why do we believe it's becoming more and more important? And that's really largely because of the pace of change we're seeing in technology and business. Think about the impact of automation, the impact it's going to have on work and jobs. So it's extremely important to stay up to date and to keep learning new skills. Although a wise person did say that it isn't actually necessary to change, survival isn't mandatory. So we've been talking a lot, about the need to keep your skills up to date. And if you've been thinking about, what skills do you need to, prosper, stay up to date in this automated world, you might like to step back and visit our Play Again page, and the hyperlink is there on the right. And listen to this presentation from last year where Ray talked about some of the skills that you need to prosper in an automating world and gave some tips for how you can start to think about that. So the first study I wanted to talk about today is our 2017 NewMR Market Research Benchmarking Study, which is an awfully big name. Some of you may have participated in the study. Thank you if you did. And some of you may have already read the report. Now, the purpose of this study was really just to start us on this learning journey to understand more about, market research skills, market research knowledge and training, what people are doing, what they're looking for. And this was a small study just to start us along the path. So what we really looked at in this project was, what's the state of market research knowledge? What sort of knowledge levels are there out there? And what types of training have people taken part in? So here are some of the study details. We ran this project back in November 2017. There was about 730 interviews. We had participants from 42 different countries, and it was an online study, and you could complete it either in English or Japanese. It was very much an opt-in sample. So we're not claiming for this to be a representative sample. And in fact, we believe it's quite likely that the sort of sample we've got would over-represent what we would perhaps call an engaged researcher. People who are involved in our community, involved in talking about research and social media, involved in networks of researchers. These people are the ones who are most likely to have taken part in our study. So we think that we'll have captured perhaps people who think more about market research, think more about learning and development. If you'd like more of the nitty-gritty study details or have a look at some data tables, see exactly what percentage of people answered what question, indeed have a look at what the questionnaire looked like. If you click on that hyperlink there, that will take you through and you can grab all of the little details. So if there's one result that stood out more than anything else in this whole project, it was what percentage of people had had no market research training through the first 11 months of 2017. So 38% of people in our sample that we think is a bit more engaged than average actually attended no training or sessions or workshops for 11 months of 2017. So we find that to be a pretty alarming figure, particularly when we're talking about how important it is to stay up to date. Now, the good news is if you're on this webinar, you are possibly not one of those people, but have a think about whether you were one of those people, and have a think about some of the people who work for you. Are any of them falling into that category, and what can you do about it? Beyond that, we put together an activity profile of the sorts of activities that people took part in and the number of times they either attended or did the activity throughout the year. So this whole table is perhaps best consumed not in a webinar, and it's certainly in the final report. So if you head to the website and download that, you'll be able to disseminate the detail. But if you just want to think about the couple of big findings out of here, it became very clear that sort of the main activity that we see people taking part in is things like reading blog posts and articles. And that was sort of followed up by people reading business books and listening into webinars. And you'll see there that the figures for things like training sessions and conferences were lower. So again, if you'd like to dig into the detail, I'd encourage you to download the report. So we talked about benchmarking current knowledge. Now, obviously it's very difficult to conduct a study where we find out everything that everybody knows about the entire field of market research. So we used a tool, if you like, to benchmark knowledge levels. We pulled out 9 topics in the broad research space. Some of them are a bit broader than research, as you'll see. And those 9 topics are listed on the side of that graph. And what we asked people to do was tell us whether they were familiar with that term, and by familiar we meant, could you explain that to somebody else? And you'll see we've sort of almost got kind of 3 or 4 groups of topics. You'll see there's a first group there where there's 4 things: Net Promoter Score, Internet of Things, augmented reality, and predictive analytics. And around about 80% of people were familiar enough to explain those to somebody. Then we see a second set of activities, things like semiotics and system 1 and 2 thinking. Only about half of the people who participated in our study felt they could explain those to somebody else. And then you see, a fairly strong drop off. About 42% of people can explain implicit association testing, a further drop to grounded theory, and then another drop to homophily. Now, it's quite fair to say that something like homophily is not something that is necessarily core market research knowledge, but we did select these activities so that we would try and get a spread, so we could see, who knew the core things, could talk about that, something like Net Promoter Score, compared to some of the more specialized or slightly adjacent areas. So that gives us a bit of a sense. And it's also interesting to see that about 4% of people could name all of them, and 4% of them actually couldn't explain those activities at all. So we wanted to increase sort of our accessibility of this data. And so we then calculated what we called a number known score. So we essentially just added up, counted how many of these topics could people explain to somebody. So that means we've got numbers from 0 to 9. If you scored a 9 on this graph, so you're over in that far right-hand column, that meant that you could explain all 9 of those topics to somebody. You can see we had 29 people in the sample who could explain all 9. So you get a sense there of, what the distribution looks like. But, something like this isn't really easy to work with. So we've then taken this a step further and conducted a really simple segmentation. And what we've said is, okay, if you can describe 6 or more, explain 6 or more of those activities to somebody, we will call you a maven. And so about 47% of our sample are what we would call mavens. And then we've got a second group who we're calling learners. And those are the people who could explain 5 or less of those concepts to somebody. So that starts to give us a sense of, how our participants broke down. Now, remembering that we have probably got more mavens in our sample than you would get in the average group of researchers. So if we assume that you would like to be a Maven, and if you've signed up for an extracurricular webinar, you've probably got a bit of interest in becoming an expert. And we had a look at, what sorts of characteristics do Mavens have? Now, perhaps not surprisingly, older people tend to know more of these terms. Now, that may well be because you learn more over the years, or it's possibly that if you're not that interested in learning extra things about research, maybe at some point before you turn 45, you actually might leave the market research industry. So we can see that older people know more. We can't necessarily say why. But working again on the assumption that you might like to be a Maven, we went and had a look at what are the activities and amounts of those activities that Mavens are doing. If you wanted to set yourself a plan of how can I become a Maven, or indeed, am I already a Maven, we put together some recommendations for becoming a Maven. So the first thing to keep in mind is that these are very much minimum recommendations. One of the things that we've learned is the more you do of these things, the better. So don't just think I only have to do these. Do as much as you can, but if you're setting some goals for you, or indeed, some of your colleagues or people who work for you, someone you're mentoring, this is a plan. So I would encourage people to try and read at least one article or blog post a month. Try and read at least 2 relevant books per year. Now, these don't have to necessarily be methodology books. They can be. They might also be, more broader business books, or maybe something coming from, the usability space or data analytics. Try and dip into other areas, but try and read 2 books that really help your knowledge every year. Make sure you're attending at least 2 training sessions or workshops per year. And definitely try and sign up for at least 2 webinars per year. It's a good idea to try and attend conferences, but we've left that out of our recommendations in the report that we wrote because we recognise that it's not easy for everybody to get to a conference. You need to get funding, you need to be able to travel, you need to get time away from the office. So if you can, great. But if you can stick with the 4 points above that, you'll be on your way to becoming a research expert. So what are some things for you to think about? Have a think about how much professional development you're doing. Be quite honest, the questionnaire is actually up on the website. So if you wanted to even complete that as part of a checklist, you could actually decide whether you're doing enough to become a Maven. You might like to think about, are you actually already a Maven? How many of those 9 topics can you explain to somebody else? And if you're an employer, if you've got staff, try and help as many staff as possible reach those Maven levels of professional development. Are you giving people time to attend 2 workshops a year? Are you encouraging people to read books or blog posts every month? And the main thing to keep in mind is more is always better. So that's the project that we did last year. And some of you will be aware that we're in the midst of designing the 2018 benchmarking study. So what we're exploring in that is we're wanting to look a little bit more at what are the types and amounts of training that people have taken part in the last 12 months. We're adding some questions around format. So we're interested to see what's the balance between face-to-face training and webinar training. And we're going to have a question in there about what skills you think you would need to develop over the next 5 years. And we're also interested in whether people are thinking that they take part in training in work time, or is it something that you're trying to fit in, out of hours? I'm conscious that some people from like the Asia Pacific region are quite possibly listening into this webinar, tonight in, in the past, what would have been called sort of leisure time. and we're now sort of fitting some of these PD activities into that time. So if you'd like to have a look at the questionnaire, we did actually put a call out to kind of our research network a little bit earlier in the year to get feedback on the questionnaire, and certainly lots of people chipped in, and the questionnaire, as you see it on the website today, is the result of feedback from lots of people. One thing you will notice, it is a very short questionnaire, and there always would be other things that it would be great to know, but we're quite deliberately keeping the questionnaire short, and we think we'd rather run these sorts of projects a little bit more frequently, but with quite short questionnaires, so that we can really maximise the amount of people who are able to take part. So as well as the questionnaire being available on the website, there's lots of other details about this next stage of the project up on the hyperlink that's on the screen there. One of the main changes that we've made this time, apart from the content changes, is we're rolling out the survey in many more languages. So this time we'll be able to offer it in English, Japanese, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, Danish, German, and Chinese, both simplified and traditional. So a big thanks to everybody who put up their hand and said, yes, I will help you with translation, because we certainly wouldn't be able to bring anywhere near that amount of languages if it wasn't for a lot of volunteers out there helping out. So we imagine we'll be able to get feedback from parts of the globe we really couldn't get before. So fingers crossed for more than 42 countries, and quite possibly a deeper reach into some of those countries as we move into more and more languages. So I'd just like to say thank you for listening, and if the thoughts of the 2018 project have piqued your interest, if you'd like to be involved, whether it's just as a participant, keep your eye out on social media. We'll be letting everybody know when the questionnaire goes live. Thanks to the people who've already chipped in to collaborate on that project, helping with translations, input into the questionnaire. And we'll be putting a shout out too for further help once we go live in terms of spreading the word through your network, so we can get as many people as possible to take part, so we can get a richer and richer picture of what the skills and training needs of people in the market research space are. So thanks very much for listening. And I think Ray will join me now to ask me questions. But if you haven't typed your question in, now's the time to head to Twitter and type the question in, put #NewMR at the end, or please go to the GoToWebinar question box and type your question in there.
Thank you, Sue. We have one question already, so let's take that. Sue, do you think it could be easier, more motivating for researchers to record their professional development completed over time? So maybe talk about some positives, maybe some of the challenges about doing, for example, the Australian diary once a year.
Well, you've also half stolen my answer. So obviously there are lots of benefits, I think, for keeping some sort of record of professional development. I'm sure any of you who sort of go through an annual performance appraisal process, you know, in some ways you're dreading it, but sometimes when you finish it, you actually, you know, it makes you feel quite chuffed about, you know, what you have achieved in a year. And I know the process of filling in the Australian QPMR diary. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Australian Market and Social Research Society has an accreditation scheme that's called QPMR, which stands for Qualified Practicing Market Researchers. And to maintain your accreditation, you need to do a certain amount of professional development every year. And how you kind of prove that you've done the right amount of professional development is by keeping a diary. It's not like a diary where you write, "Dear diary, today I went to a course," but it's a record of what you've done. And it actually does mean that year on year, you're actually keeping a really good picture of what you're doing. I'm fortunate enough that I don't actually usually have to worry about points. I actually usually have lots and lots of points, mainly because I get to attend lots of NewMR events. But I think it is actually in some ways similar to that Maven recommendation, it does set down what the minimum amount of PD you should be doing. So that means you've got a goal to get to and records to keep. So it actually does give you something to shoot for. In terms of motivating, I think probably, well, we know that different people react differently, but certainly seeing that you've got, goals set and things to fill in, make it easier. And I think sometimes it probably encourages people to dip into some of those adjacent areas we've been talking about. If you're needing to complete a certain amount of professional development in a year, you actually will start to look at, perhaps something you've not thought of before. You can see, there's a webinar about usability. Oh, I'm needing to get some points. I'll go to the usability webinar. Whereas otherwise you might, keep, going down, one path, whereas it perhaps gives you more opportunities or even more sort of visibility that there are other courses that you can be attending.
And one final question. We see some people talking about PD, we see some people talking about HR, but I had an interesting meeting on Friday with head of a significantly growing agency, and all the conversation there was about talent. So there was a head of talent, and each team had somebody who was looking after talent development. Do you think maybe even some of those little changes, like moving away from the bureaucratic language of HRPD, might have some benefits?
I certainly think it could, and in some ways I think doesn't talent sound like a nice way of describing it, but then I think at least some points people in HR have kind of grabbed talent as their word, and in fact sometimes finding talent is a pseudonym for recruitment as opposed to necessarily a process of finding talented researchers or making people who work for you who are talented even more talented. But it's nice.
You could well be right. Okay, Sue, thank you very much. A shout out again to all of our sponsors.